Chapter 6, J.D. Tippit, Conspirator or Hero. In its first and most discerning editorial look at the Warren Commission report, the New York Times noted that the Commission's finding that Lee Harvey Oswald killed Patrolman J.D. Tippit was not as strongly supported by evidence as its finding that Oswald killed Kennedy. This is true. Largely because of confused and inconsistent witnesses, the only witness available, the proof that Oswald shot Tippit, has never been as satisfying as the conclusive evidence that he was Kennedy's lone assassin. Sensing this, critics of the Warren Commission report have seized upon the Tippit murder as an Achilles heel of the Commission's work. With amazing ambivalence, they contend at times that Oswald did not kill Tippit, and at others that, if he did, there must have been a second gunman and therefore a conspiracy. Weisberg, in his whitewash, even suggests that, far from being a hero, Tippit was involved in some dark conspiracy, perhaps with Jack Ruby, to kill Oswald. Actually, it was not necessary for the Commission to prove Oswald killed Tippit in establishing that he killed Kennedy. But because of the Commission's broad order from Johnson to ascertain facts relating to the President's death, it spent many hours on the Tippit killing. In the process, it developed a second homicide case against Oswald that, despite some weaknesses, would have most likely have resulted in his conviction in any court in the land. Oswald's precipitate departure from the book depository, long before he was a suspect, was a classic demonstration of the adage that the guilty flee when none pursue. The Commission found that Oswald left the book depository at about 12:33 p.m., 3 minutes after the shot that killed Kennedy, and proceeded to his rooming house by bus and taxi. There, he put on a zipper jacket, then walked to a point about a mile away where Patrolman Tippit, apparently having heard a police radio description of the Kennedy murder suspect, stopped him. Oswald killed the policeman with 4 shots, then started off towards the Texas Theater, dropping empty shells from his .38 caliber snub-nosed revolver and shedding his jacket in a parking lot along the way. Near the theater, he aroused the suspicion of a shoe store manager who saw him duck into the movie without buying a ticket. Police searched the theater and, after a struggle in which Oswald pulled his pistol, arrested him. The Commission based its findings of Oswald's guilt on, number 1, his identification by 2 actual witnesses to the shooting, plus that of 7 who heard the shots and saw him leave the scene, gun in hand. Number 2, evidence establishing Oswald's ownership of the mail-order pistol he was carrying when arrested. Number 3, testimony of gun experts who testified the fatal shots came from that pistol. And number 4, evidence establishing that Oswald owned the zipper jacket he dropped off in flight. In their broadside attack on the Commission's case, the critics, number 1, insist the Commission's timetable for Oswald's movements is too tight. Number 2, question the credibility of most adverse witnesses. 3, challenge the validity of findings by the ballistics experts. And number 4, reject Marina Oswald's identification of her husband's zipper jacket. Marina is uniformly regarded as a villainess by the critics. Lane's attack on the timetable, an effort to prove Oswald could not have reached the scene of the Tippit murder by 1:16 p.m., is basically an exposition of the weaknesses inherent in eyewitness testimony. If this seems strange coming from a man who built his whole grassy knoll theory on the recollections of excited eyewitnesses, so be it. It is, at the same time, a demonstration of the fact that when Lane likes what eyewitnesses say, he credits it, but when their testimony does not exonerate Oswald, he rejects it as absurd. The first witness he attacks is Cecil J. McWaters, the bus driver who picked up Oswald near the book depository a few minutes after the Kennedy shooting. Lane emphasizes the fact that after positively identifying Oswald in a police lineup, McWaters had second thoughts and said he might have confused Oswald with a teenager who rode regularly on his Marcellus bus line. Lane virtually ignores the fact that when he was arrested, Oswald had in his pocket a Marcellus line transfer good until 1 p.m. Friday, November 22nd, 1963, validated in two places by McWaters' distinctive punch mark. It was one of only two transfers McWaters had issued on that run that day. The other one, he testified, went to a woman. Thus, although it never comes through to Lane's readers, the driver's punch mark more than offset his confusion. Lane also attacks, and with good reason, the credibility of William Wally, a cab driver who picked Oswald up shortly after he got off the bus, which got snarled in a traffic jam caused by the assassination. Wally produced a log of his trips on November 22nd showing he had picked up a passenger for 500 North Beckley between 12:30 and 12:45 p.m. that day. He also identified Oswald in a police lineup as that passenger. That address is about 5 blocks from Oswald's rooming house at 1026 North Beckley Avenue, and it is a fair assumption that Oswald, fleeing from the scene of a murder, would not ask a cab driver to deliver him to his door. But while testifying, Wally put an X on a map of Dallas at what he thought was the intersection of Netchess and Beckley, which do not intersect, and said, "Yes, sir, that is right, because that is the 500 block of North Beckley." Finding his testimony somewhat imprecise, the commission sent investigators back to Dallas to retrace with another driver the route Wally's cab took that day. Wally directed the driver to a point in the 700 block of North Beckley and said that was where Oswald got out. Lane scoffs at this procedure. To accept Wally's testimony, he says, the commission had to disprove almost every statement initially made by Wally. This is a dazzling assertion, but it does not vitiate Wally's convincing identification of Oswald as his passenger. "I knew he was the right one as soon as I saw him," or the mute evidence of the bus transfer. Despite Lane's contentiousness, the evidence simply confirms Oswald's own statement to the police after his arrest, that to get home after the shooting, he first boarded a slow-moving bus, got a transfer, then changed to a cab. Lane's argument is that Oswald could have not reached his rooming house on North Beckley by 1 p.m. when the housekeeper, Mrs. Earlene Roberts, said he did. But in a reconstruction of his trip, Secret Service and FBI agents walked from the depository to where he caught the bus, 6.5 minutes, rode the bus through heavy traffic for 2 blocks, 4 minutes, walked to where he caught the cab, 4 minutes, rode the cab to where Wally finally said he got out, 6 minutes, then walked to his home, 5 minutes. This 25.5 minutes of travel time, added to his estimated 12:33 p.m. departure from the depository, would put him in the door of the rooming house at 12:58.5 p.m. Mrs. Roberts, who knew Oswald under his alias of O.H. Lee, testified that he wasn't running, but he was walking pretty fast. He was all but running. When she said, "Oh, you are in a hurry," Oswald did not respond. In shirt sleeves, he went to his room, stayed 3 or 4 minutes, then came down, putting on a zipper jacket, and left. Mrs. Roberts last saw him a few seconds later standing near a bus stop in front of the house. His departure, as the commission demonstrated, left him plenty of time to get to the scene of the Tippit murder, 9/10 of a mile away, by 1:15 or 1:16 p.m. when Tippit was shot. Again, Lane employs a smokescreen attack, apparently on the theory that if he can obfuscate any question raised by any witness testimony, then that testimony is invalid on its major points. For example, on the strength of Mrs. Roberts' testimony that she last saw Oswald standing at a bus stop on the northbound side of the street, Lane writes that he was presumably waiting for a northbound bus. Such a bus would have taken him away from the Tippit murder. Mrs. Roberts specifically stated she did not see which direction he went when he left there. It is equally fair to presume that he paused a moment to decide which way to go, particularly in view of the fact that other witnesses placed him alongside Tippit's police car a few minutes later. Lane also reads much into the fact that Mrs. Roberts had never seen Oswald's pistol while cleaning his room. How many roomers leave pistols out for their landladies to examine? And which is more important, the Commission's documentary proof that Oswald owned the pistol or the fact that his housekeeper never saw it? Next, Lane makes a devious attack on the Commission's timetable, moving Oswald to the Tippit murder. First, he cuts by about 1/3 the amount of time Oswald had to get there. Just about 8 minutes after Oswald was seen at the bus stop, he says, Tippit was shot to death nearly 1 mile away. Testimony and the police radio log establishing the time of Tippit's murder indicate Oswald had about 12, not 8 minutes to walk that 9/10 of a mile. Then, by cleverly excerpting the testimony of William Scoggins, a cab driver who witnessed the Tippit murder, he attempts to prove that the policeman's killer was walking west rather than east, as the Commission contends when stopped by Tippit. To approach from the west would require a longer walk for Oswald. He quotes Scoggins only as saying the killer was going west or was in the process of turning around, but he was facing west when I saw him. What Scoggins actually said was that he saw someone that looked to me like he was going west. Now, I couldn't exactly say whether he was going west or was in the process of turning around, but he was facing west when I saw him. By dropping the words, I couldn't exactly say whether, Lane changes the whole import of that statement. The Dallas police radio dispatcher had broadcast a description of the suspect wanted for the president's shooting 3 times at 12:45, 12:48, and 12:55 p.m. By the time Tippit, cruising near the intersection of 10th Street and Patton Avenue, stopped a man who answered that description. White male, approximately 30, slender build, height 5 foot 10 inches, weight 165 pounds. The man walked to Tippit's car and talked to him through the right window. Tippit got out and started to walk in front of the car. As he did, the man he was questioning pulled a revolver and fired several shots. Tippit was killed instantly. Perhaps the best witness was the taxi driver Scoggins, who was eating his lunch in his cab about 100 feet away. Scoggins saw the suspect, wearing a light-colored jacket, approach the car, saw Tippit get out, heard 3 or 4 shots, then saw Tippit fall. Scoggins hid behind his cab as the gunman, muttering "poor damn cop" or "poor dumb cop," passed within 12 feet of him and ran south on Patton. Another witness, Domingo Benavides, driving a pickup truck, was approaching Tippit's car on 10th Street when he saw Tippit and the suspect, one on each side of the police car. Then heard 3 shots and saw Tippit fall. Benavides braked his truck and watched as the gunman ran away, dropping empty shells from his pistol into a clump of bushes nearby. Benavides then got out, ran to Tippit's car, and using his police radio, notified police headquarters. "We've had a shooting out here." The message came in about 1:16 p.m. Mrs. Helen Markham, a waitress, witnessed the shooting and then stood terrified, peeking between her fingers as the gunman trotted by her, fooling with his gun. "I was afraid he was fixing to kill me," she said. 2 younger women, Barbara Jeanette Davis and Virginia Davis, in an apartment at 10th and Patton, heard the shots, ran to their door, and saw the gunman, pistol in hand, cut across their lawn. Of these 5 witnesses close to the scene of the shooting, 4 positively identified Oswald in police lineups as the gunman they saw. The 5th, Benavides, was not taken to a lineup, but testified that a picture of Oswald he saw later on TV resembled the man who shot Tippit. In a used car lot a block away on Patton Avenue, 2 more men, Ted Calloway and Sam Gwynyard, heard shots, ran to the sidewalk, and saw a man go by with a pistol in his right hand. Calloway yelled, "Hey man, what the hell is going on?" The gunman stopped, said something unintelligible, then continued his flight. Both Calloway and Gwynyard positively identified Oswald in a police lineup as the gunman they saw fleeing from the Tippit murder. In the next block, 4 men saw a white man running with a pistol in his right hand. None of them attended a lineup, but all 4 subsequently looked at photographs of Oswald and said he either resembled or was the gunman they saw. So did another witness, who from about a block away heard the shots and saw the killer run from Tippit's car. In the end, the police and the commission had a dozen witnesses who were at or near the scene of the murder, many more than the average prosecutor ever dreams of rounding up. Of these, 6 identified Oswald in police lineups. The testimony of 2 witnesses to the murder, Scoggins and Mrs. Markham, and of 7 of the witnesses who saw Oswald running away would have been sufficient to convict Oswald even if he had not been caught with the murder weapon. In his seeming effort to obscure this obvious truth, Lane says judiciously that the commission departed from the inferences that the evidence justified, and then levels his heaviest artillery at the most confused witness he can find. That witness is Helen Markham, and for Lane, this is like shooting fish in a barrel. Mrs. Markham was a bewildered and bewildering witness before the commission. Though she never backed away from her identification of Oswald, she sounded mystical at times. It will also be seen that Lane, in his dual role as lawyer, author, added considerably to her and the commission's confusion. When she first appeared before the commission in March 1964, Mrs. Markham, who said she had an 8th grade education, opened her testimony with the statement, "I am very shook up." In inimitable style, she recounted the Tippit shooting. He, Tippit, was driving real slow, almost up to this man, and this man kept walking, and the police car going real slow now, real slow, and they just kept coming into the curb, and finally they got way up there a little ways up. Well, it stopped. I saw the man come over to the car very slowly, leaned and put his arms just like this. He leaned over in this window and looked in this window. Well, I didn't think nothing about it. The police are nice and friendly. The policeman calmly opened the door very slowly, wasn't angry or nothing. He calmly crawled out of his car, and just as he had gotten even with the wheel on the driver's side, this man shot the policeman. After about a half an hour of this, when Mrs. Markham was asked about the police lineup, at which she identified Oswald, she apparently went blank. Lane gleefully quotes the following exchange between her and counsel. "Now, when you went into the lineup room, you looked these people over, these 4 men. Yes, sir. Did you recognize anyone in the lineup? No, sir." He does not go on to report that after this startling lapse, she stated firmly that she identified the number 2 man in the lineup, Oswald, and reaffirmed her identification several times in her rambling testimony. Lane's handling in his book of his long-distance interview with Mrs. Markham 3 weeks before she testified is even more shocking. In that conversation, he reports, Mrs. Markham stated that Tippit's killer was a short man, somewhat on the heavy side, and with slightly bushy hair. This is hardly a description of Oswald, and Lane doesn't tell his readers how she happened to give him that description. This is revealed only in Volume 7 of the hearings, where Mrs. Markham testified that Lane called her at work at the Eat Well restaurant and said he was calling from the police department of the City Hall and he had to get a little more information. How Lane suggested that description to her is revealed in Volume 20 of the hearings. There, the commission printed a transcript of the Lane-Markham interview from a tape recording of the talk made by Lane. In the version of the conversation reluctantly supplied to the commission by Lane, he identifies himself as an attorney investigating the Oswald case, and then asks, "I wonder if you would be good enough to tell me the description of the man you saw." Markham: Yes, but this is an office business phone, and I just can't tell you. I don't have the time. Lane: But, well, could you just give me one moment and tell me? I read that you told some of the reporters that he was short, stocky, and had bushy hair. Markham: No, no, I did not say this. Lane: You did not say that? Markham: No, sir. Lane: Well, would you say that he was stocky? Markham: He was short. Lane: He was short. Markham: Yes. Lane: And he was a little bit on the heavy side? Markham: Not too heavy. Lane: Not too heavy, but slightly heavy? Markham: Well, he was. No, he wasn't. He didn't look too heavy. Lane: He wasn't too heavy. And would you say that he had rather bushy hair, kind of hair? Markham: Yeah, just a little bit bushy. Uh-huh. Lane: It was a little bit bushy. Markham: Yes. From this transcript, it is clear that of the descriptive terms attributed to Mrs. Markham by Lane, short, somewhat on the heavy side, and slightly bushy hair, only the word short originated with Mrs. Markham. She denied Lane's suggestion that the gunman she saw was even slightly heavy, and agreed reluctantly to Lane's suggestion that his hair was rather bushy. When Lane tried again later in the interview to suggest that the man she saw was a little bit on the heavy side, Mrs. Markham came up with a disappointing estimate of around 100, maybe 150 pounds for the gunman's weight. Re-questioned, hopefully by Lane, on the bushy hair, she made it plain she was talking about Oswald's hair when she saw him at the police lineup. Well, you wouldn't say it hadn't been combed, or anything. Of course, he probably had been through a lot, and it was kind of tore up a little. It is not surprising that Lane was reluctant to give the Warren Commission a tape of his interview with Mrs. Markham. He did so only after Chief Justice Warren told him, "We have reason to doubt the truthfulness of everything you have heretofore told us." It is surprising that he still distorted Mrs. Markham's description of the gunman in his book after the commission had published its hearings. The commission ultimately found even the skittery Mrs. Markham more believable than Lane, addressing itself slowly to the probative value of Mrs. Markham's contemporaneous description of the gunman and her positive identification of Oswald at a police lineup. It said in its report, "The commission considers her testimony reliable." Then it added, "However, even in the absence of Mrs. Markham's testimony, there is ample evidence to identify Oswald as the killer of Tippit." Within minutes of the Tippit murder, the Dallas police dispatcher broadcast a description of the fleeing gunman given to a policeman at the scene by Mrs. Markham and Barbara Jeanette Davis. Again, it was remarkably accurate. White male, about 30, 5'8", black hair, slender, wearing a white jacket, white shirt, and dark slacks. And police noted immediately that it tallied with the description of the Kennedy murder suspect. What had been added was the white jacket, the jacket that Oswald picked up at his rooming house and shed in a parking lot as he ran towards the Texas Theater. In his last effort to challenge the eyewitness case against Oswald before moving to the gun and ballistic evidence, Lane contends that the witnesses gave different descriptions of the jacket and that Marina Oswald's identification of it as her husband's cannot be believed. Actually, what is notable about the testimony of witnesses on this point is that so many of them came so close to agreeing. Benavides said light beige, Mrs. Markham light, short, kind of grayish tan, Scoggins light colored, Virginia Davis light brown tan. In addition, Calloway identified the jacket found in the parking lot as the jacket worn by the gunman. In the face of this consensus, plus Marina's identification of the jacket, Lane tells his readers that the commission alleged the jacket to be Oswald's. The facts of Oswald's capture in the Texas Theater at the end of his flight are apparently too well known to tempt Lane into challenging them. He does not contest the fact that Oswald owned a 38 caliber special Smith & Wesson revolver, had it with him, and tried to use it on the police officers who seized him. Oswald himself insisted that his only crime was carrying a gun and resisting arrest, but Lane does mount a fierce attack on the evidence provided by the pistol. His quarrel, it turns out, is more with the Dallas police than the commission. The police, in collecting the empty shells near the scene of the murder and in handling the 4 bullets recovered from Tippit's body, failed to maintain a clear chain of possession of the evidence usually required in criminal trials. For example, Patrolman A initials the bullets and turns them over to Sergeant B for safekeeping. At the time of the trial, B certifies them as the bullets handed to him by A, and A then testifies. In the case of Tippit's killer, there was little question that the 4 empty cartridge cases dropped in the bushes at 10th and Patton came from his gun. 3 witnesses who saw him discard the shells went to the bushes minutes later and found them. But before the commission, there was confusion as to which witnesses, Benavides, Barbara Jeanette Davis, or Virginia Davis, handed which empty shells, or hulls, as the Dallas police call them, to which police officers. Some confusion also resulted from the fact that 3 of the bullets recovered from Tippit were manufactured by Winchester Warren and the 4th by Remington Peters, while 2 of the shells were Winchester Warren and 2 were Remington Peters. There were several possible explanations for this. For example, if the killer fired 5 cartridges, 3 Winchester and 2 Remington, the police simply failed to recover 1 Remington bullet, which missed Tippit, and 1 Winchester shell. Oswald had 3 bullets of each make in his reloaded pistol when arrested. This seemed plausible. In fact, one witness said he heard 5 shots, but to the conspiracy-minded Lane, it suggested there was 2 gunmen. Though Lane didn't point it out, this suggestion is incompatible with the testimony of 4 firearm experts, 3 from the FBI and 1 from the Illinois Bureau of Criminal Identification Investigation. After studying the shells, which can be traced to 1 gun by breech face and firing pin marks, just as a bullet can by its striations, all 4 experts said they had been fired by 1 gun, Oswald's Smith & Wesson Special. The news on this microscopic study of the bullets, which is hard to find in Lane's book, was not so conclusive, but neither was it good for Oswald. Although comparisons were difficult because the gun barrel was slightly oversized for the bullets and 3 bullets were mutilated, FBI expert Cortland Cunningham found that all 4 bullets could have been fired from Oswald's pistol. Joseph D. Nickel, summoned from Illinois as an independent non-federal police expert, could make no determination on the 3 mutilated bullets, but he found that the 4th bullet was fired from Oswald's gun to the exclusion of all others. In the face of all the evidence, eyewitnesses and objective, Lane tells his readers the clues point in no specific direction. The bullets lead to no one. The combination of bullets and shells seems to lead toward the possibility of 2 assailants. And Weisberg concludes the result in the Tippit case was that the commission proved Oswald could not have been the murderer. The truth is, despite some police bungling, the state of Texas had a good murder case against Oswald before it linked him to the Kennedy assassination. The positive identification of all 4 shells and 1 bullet with Oswald's gun probably would have sealed his fate had all the eyewitnesses been myopic and mongoloid. As it turned out, the Tippit and Kennedy cases merged at the Dallas police station a few minutes after Oswald was brought in from the Texas Theater. At about 2:15 p.m., Captain J. Will Fritz, Chief of Homicide, returned from the book depository to the station and ordered a detective to get a search warrant and pick up a man named Lee Oswald. Sergeant Gerald L. Hill, who had brought Oswald in, asked why Oswald was wanted. Well, Fritz replied, He was employed down at the book depository, and he had not been present for a roll call of the employees. Said Hill, "Captain, we will save you a trip." There he sits.